What's up YouTube, how goes it? So today we're doing a long-term review of Apple's M1 chip. It's been out for quite some time now and I've been using the Mac Mini with the M1 chip as my primary driver for about 7 or so months, and I have a fair opinion on what I think the M1 excels in and a few areas of improvement. But perhaps an even more important question a lot of people ask is, should I wait for the new M2 chip or whatever Apple's gonna call their next generation of the M processor? Well, honestly, I think for a lot of people that wait is kind of pointless, and hopefully through this video I can convince you why you might just want to get that M1 instead of holding for the M2. As always, if you guys enjoy the content, hit the like button, subscribe to my channel. Thanks for watching, let's go. So just a disclaimer, I've been using again the Mac Mini as my primary driver, and the configuration I have is the M1 version with 16GB of RAM and 256GB SSD. Now it is worth noting that I've also used the M1 MacBook Air for some time with the 8GB configuration, so I have a pretty strong opinion of how they fare and where their strengths and weaknesses are. Let's start off with the biggest strength of the M1 chip, and that's day-to-day usage. That one might be surprising for a lot of people, but hear me out. So when Apple first announced the M1 chip and it transitioned to a ARM-based processor, a number of people, actually a lot of people, were concerned that that transition may not be a very smooth process. Understandably so, of course. But Apple actually nailed it. If you take a Intel Mac user or any x86 user in general and make them use an M1 product, you'll find that they cannot tell the difference in day-to-day usage, whether that's web browsing, watching some Netflix, some YouTube, doing some good old word processing, or even loading up more complex softwares. It feels just like any other computer. It behaves the same way. Software feels the same way again, and again, behaves the same way. So when you take that into consideration, it's a very well thought out and very well done process. A lot of people might say the first generation is often the beta product, but the M1 doesn't feel like a beta or guinea pig product at all. In fact, it feels super refined, and for the most part, it's a very well done transition, and you will not feel much of a bump when coming from an x86 architecture based device. While the M1's biggest strength may be its nearly flawless transition, its biggest flex has to be just the sheer amount of raw power this chipset brings, considering its efficiency. So whether you're doing 4K video editing or even the occasional gaming, dare I say, on a Mac, you'll find that the M1 chip is a total beast. So I, believe it or not, have actually been doing most of my editing on Final Cut Pro on my Mac Mini. So in fact, the past 40 or so videos you've seen of mine, if you have seen any of them, are all edited on Final Cut Pro in 4K. And I'll tell you one thing right now, I have yet to have a single frame drop. I can seriously push that thing to great limits and that thing performs super smooth. Now, one big disclaimer is that I use the 16GB configuration to do most of my 4K editing. I did find when I use 8GB with the M1 configuration, there is the occasional frame drop and rendering times are definitely slower. So keep in mind, again, you should really try to get the 16GB version if you have the extra cash. But the point I'm trying to make over here is that the M1 is a very impressive chip. Seriously, if you're just going to be doing 4K or 1080p video editing or anything lesser than that in terms of resource intensivity, you do not need to wait for a M2 chip. There is little to no benefit in doing so. Things already work as fast as they reasonably should, and you're not going to get a whole lot of benefit by waiting it out. Another huge factor a lot of people notice when they go over to the M1 is the fact that you really have to try to make the fan on the M1 spin. I mean, seriously, it's like a extreme sport to try and get the fan on the M1 spinning loud enough so you can hear it. Don't get me wrong, the fan is spinning, it's super quiet, but to actually get it in full throttle or even close to it, you really have to push the device. So I did 6K editing with a lot of layers and I finally got the fan to briefly go on. And mind you, it only went on for I think about 30 or so seconds and then it calmed right down. If you're doing anything less than that, the fan practically never goes off. I think in my time, maybe it's gone off 2 or 3 times in total. With that being said, of course, the other benefit of the M1 chip is its power efficiency. So the M1 chip is pretty standard across the MacBook Air, the MacBook Pro, and the Mac Mini. The biggest difference being the Mac Mini and the MacBook Pro have active cooling, meaning they actually have a dedicated fan, so they can technically go to higher limits than the MacBook Air. But you can even do 4K editing on the MacBook Air, and that thing doesn't even have a fan. So seriously, I mean, again, does this sound like a beta product? Does this sound like a product you need to wait out on? I don't think so. so. I mean, I'm only trying to build my case here to convince you guys to stop waiting on the M2 unless you have a particular use case. Now, I know there's a handful of you who are like, this guy's an Apple fanatic. I'm out. Well, hang on. While my experience with the M1 Mac Mini has been vastly positive, there are definitely certain problems that have been a pain in my butt. Problem number one, USB ports. So the USB controller on the M1 products is horrendous. I found on numerous occasions when using a USB A type connection, third-party accessories like keyboards, mice, hard drives often will not connect the first time, or in some cases they might just randomly disconnect. Transfer speeds are also slower than the Intel counterparts compared to their USB 3.0 ports. It's also worth noting that using accessories like switches sometimes are entirely incompatible with the Mac Mini's USB-A port. To make matters even more interesting, you'll find that the USB-C port is Thunderbolt 3, while for the average user this practically means absolutely nothing. A lot of people out there actually want the latest Thunderbolt standard, which is Thunderbolt 4, because that allows you to support up to 4K displays on a single connection at the exact same time. Thunderbolt 3 is definitely limited in this regard, and it's the only option you get with any M1 lineup at the moment. This might be something that a lot of people wait for until Apple can get the latest standard on their newer chipsets. Another final problem that I think is a big one for a lot of people, including myself, is the fact that currently you can only get a maximum of 16 gigabytes of RAM on any M1 product. And honestly, this is a pretty big limitation. I know there's all kinds of Apple fanboys like, but RAM in the Apple world is like, twice as much. No. 16 gigabytes of RAM is just 16 gigabytes of RAM. Yes, M1 optimized programs might use their RAM more efficiently, but sooner or later you're into a bottleneck. And I'm really hoping that with the next iteration of the M series chips, we'll see 32 and arguably 64 gigabytes of RAM at least, because I think there's a lot of power users out there who will benefit from this, particularly if you're doing exhausting tasks like 6K or 8K video editing, for example. So these are all prominent flaws that are there, and for some people they might entirely break their use case. And yes, for people like those, I definitely think waiting for the next series of M chips or whatever Apple rolls out next is definitely worth waiting for. One other factor I want to mention that might be important to some people, this is particularly true if you're getting the MacBook Pro or the MacBook Air, is the enhanced battery life compared to the Intel counterparts. Apple claims you can get up to 18 hours of battery life on a single charge of the MacBook Air. During my time of usage using a mixed amount of applications that are both heavy and light in nature, I found I got about 16 hours of real-world usage. And again, Apple claims the theoretical maximum, but this was a more realistic maximum that I got, which is still impressive by every account out there. If you are someone who needs all-day battery life, 16 hours on a modern-day laptop, I mean seriously, Intel is a great fire starter, but they definitely don't do a very good job at making all-day battery life, and that's something that Apple has now once again dominated the industry standard with. So keep that in mind as well. Of course, with that being said, I still think the M1 Mac Mini, MacBook Pro, or MacBook Air are all fantastic choices. You should get one if you don't have an issue like I mentioned earlier. For most people, you don't need the extra power, and the M1 is not a beta product. It's not a guinea pig product. It's a very well polished product, and for 95% of people, it will meet your use case, unless, like I said, of course, you have a very technical or specific issue that you need resolved before you can go to Apple's latest standard of their M chips. All in all, guys, I hope you found this video to be helpful. I hope you'll make the right consideration, and I hope I'm able to push you in the right direction, whatever that might be. As always, if you enjoyed the content, hit that like button, subscribe to my channel. Thank you for watching. Catch you in the next one.